Hello. I'm happy to connect here with my friend and international educator colleague, Myron Dueck, who is currently right now in Summerlin, British Columbia, who happens to be a principal and an author. And we're here to talk about his books, Grading Smarter, Not Harder, and his other new book, Giving Students a Say, which is about smarter assessment practices to empower and engage, which we'll shortly get to. But first, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Catarina Song Chen. I am the director of the American School of Belo Horizonte, located in Brazil. I have been serving as the head of school here for 12 years now, more than a decade. And I also serve on the board of SchoolRubric and other international and educational organizations. But SchoolRubric is responsible for creating this platform to bring international educators from around the world together to connect the dots, as the mission states, and increase our awareness and network by knowledge building. Myron, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Oh, thanks, Catarina. I'm Myron Dueck. I wear a bunch of hats. I'm in my administrative office right now of a high school. We'll get to that later. I've authored a couple books, Grading Smarter, Not Harder, and Giving Students a Say, which you mentioned. Got a son and daughter. My daughter's in grade 9. My son's in grade 11. Well, they're moving on next year to the next grades. And my partner and I, Tracy, my wife, we live here in Summerland, British Columbia, and have weathered a most interesting year.
Yeah, I bet. And we'll get to how you weathered this current pandemic that we've all been through. I am curious, as I'm sure the rest of our audience is, Myron, how did you go from, being a school administrator and then later into the world of educational consulting? I'm really curious to know more about your career trajectory.
Well, I'm sure nobody wants a life story, so I'll give you the salient points. Okay, so I taught in Manitoba, Canada, and then I took a job in New Zealand, and I ended up back here in British Columbia, and it didn't take long till I had my dream job. I had the high school job I had wanted, teaching the courses I wanted. It was perfect. Now, what that position in the high school did offer me, I didn't know it at the time, was the kind of the perfect incubator for trying some grading and assessment things. And, went to a conference in 2006 where Rick Stiggins really jarred me with, do you know where your students are going, and do they know where they are now, and would they be able to close the gap? And I, right about that very same time, came the opportunity to take on a vice principal position, as they would call it here in British Columbia. And at that very same time, I had gone to a conference or two, and I had shared what I was trying in my classroom. And I'll never forget when a principal came up to me at a conference that I had normally been a participant at, but now I was speaking, and he handed me a card and said, "Would you come speak to my staff?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm a high school history teacher who's just getting into administration. And I'll never forget, as I was still reeling from that question, I got back to my email, Catarina, and there was an email from the University of Kentucky saying, "We understand you are an international speaker on the topic of unit plans, and would you visit UK?" And I'm laughing about that, showing my administrator at the time, and he goes, "Myron, you were speaking at an American conference. You're Canadian. Yeah, that makes it international." Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And what were you talking about? Unit plans. I guess you're an international speaker on unit plans. And I knowing that you were going to ask a question, probably something like this, I went back and looked, and I think my first year I had 3 visits that I went to schools. The next year it was 5, then 8, then 15, then 40. And it's just gone that way. And I've been to your school, EABH,
right.
One of many. And then as the world goes in a circle, I'm back in a school this year, thanks to no travel with COVID. So that's been absolutely amazing to try things again in a school setting. And I'm teaching a class, talk about things coming full circle. And I was able to try a bunch of things in the realm of grading and assessment that I've been aching to try, and I did. So
Wow. No, that's awesome. And voila, and that's how you became an international educational consultant.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Can I just say though that I usually tell people I'm on a journey. I just happen to be able to share that journey internationally. I'm still learning, still growing, still trying things. So that's what I am, on a journey.
That's right. And so let's move a little back to your journey when you wrote the book, Grading Smarter, Not Harder. And I know it's about assessment strategies that motivate kids and help them learn. And this has been out for a few years now. Can you share a little bit of just a few examples of assessment policies that you believe can be detrimental to student motivation, and a few that you believe that are constructive and would be reflective of authentic student learning?
Sure. Let's be clear. When I wrote that book, Grading Smarter, Not Harder, I didn't think anybody would read it. I didn't think it would ever get published. It was going to be kind of a 6-year, it'd be my story of trying this in my classroom for about 6 years, right? And what I found out through taking a lot of notes and so on, that if you want to talk about detrimental things, a few come to mind. One is students having no idea where the learning is heading, right? We often, at least in my class, I would just kind of start teaching and we would explore things as we go along, which is all fine. But I came to realize that students want to know. They want to know what the learning outcomes are going to be and what they need to do to be successful. So building a clear map for that is really good for students. I found that one and done assessments are not backed by research, nor are they backed by the experience I have in this mythical place called the real world. So for example, for most of my teaching career, I would offer, say, a test in my class, no chance for students to revisit those learning outcomes. Hey, it's a test, you should have studied, all those kinds of things. But it turns out that we learn through testing. We learn through struggle. Bork and Bork at UCLA are just one of many research teams out there that say we have not harnessed the power of assessment for learning. We have certainly harnessed it for testing, but the real power is in how people learn. And I have to say, just a quick one, Catarina, is I was contacted by a newspaper in the United States that was asking me about this recently, and they said, our school board has decided that the real world, I mean, you get one chance. I said, you know what? We are doing our kitchen renovation right now, and the engineers have come back 4 times with mistakes, and this is the best engineering firm that we could possibly find. And I'm happy that we come around on the mistakes. I'm happy we're talking about them, because I don't want our fridge in the middle of the kitchen floor. I want it where it belongs. And I think the real world is a place that does have redos. It does have ongoing assessment. I just think schools need to catch up, if anyone does. And I guess thirdly, I think we have to decide what our grades actually represent. I mean, most teachers would say my grades reflect what my students have learned and where they are by the benchmarks of what I want to teach. But then we throw things in like late deductions. We throw things in like grading homework when we don't know who did it. I mean, maybe it's only in British Columbia that students may look over somebody's shoulder on homework and take their ideas. Probably not at a place like EABH where they're just so morally sound that they would never do such a thing. But honestly, around the, pardon my sarcasm, around the world, I don't think we have quite understood that we need to separate where students are at academically from the behaviors they exhibit on their way there. I think those are things that we need to look at.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you just said about how struggling is part of the process. And that is so true. And how assessment needs to be a part of the learning. It's not just a grade. And so this kind of brings me to your new book that you just published, Giving Students a Say, Smart Assessment Practices to Empower and Engage. could you briefly describe, yeah, there you go. Could you briefly describe some of the main ideas of this book? And how would you say that this deviates, or does it build upon your previous book on assessment strategies?
That's another fantastic question. You know, I've tried to summarize it this way. I think Grading Smarter, Not Harder was from a teacher's perspective, with lots of student stories to I guess support or exemplify my paradigm shift. That some of the things I spoke about in your last question. This book comes from the place where we might want to start with the actual origins of the word assessment. It comes from the Latin, which means to sit beside. And I've really been having this one mull over in my brain: to sit beside, to sit beside. I mean, what would our assessment look like if we were figuratively or literally sitting beside the student, tackling what we need to tackle? It's the way you would learn to make a lemon meringue pie with your grandmother. It would be beside, and it would be working on the same thing. So if there's, I would say giving students a say builds on this first book. So for example, in Grading Smarter, Not Harder, sure, we talk about the importance of sharing targets. In giving students a say, I take the next step and say, well, what would it look like to co-create those? What would it look like to give students voice and choice and agency in some of the things we have reserved entirely for ourselves? And then the funny thing is that I think we actually have the opportunity to not leave our schools at the end of the day dead tired as an educator if we would share some of the workload with our students, get them involved rather than us seemingly having to control everything. So again, I dove into grading issues with my first book, but now even grading is tackled from the student perspective. So for example, what language do we want to speak in grading? And people are like, what do you mean, what language? Do you want to tell a student you're a 92 in math and find out that really that's not much different than a 93 or a 91? Is that the language you want to speak? Or is there a way to describe the learning, to have people intimate what they're figuring out and what they're not? Because I think that too is far more reflective of wherever they're heading, whether that's the workspace, whether that's universities, colleges, to be able to speak about your learning much more so than a number. So those are some, I guess, Catarina, some of the things that come to mind when people ask me how this book might be different from the first.
And it just seems so obvious, but many times it's as educators, we overlook this. And I really appreciate what you just said about assessment, right? And it's about, sitting beside your students. And as we create assessments, we're doing this for students. So why not involve students and also allow the assessments to be by the students? I think that gives us a lot of food for thought, Myron. And yeah.
Well, I think so. And Catarina, you use the word obvious. I mean, lately, Tracy and I in our house say, if you can't find something, look right in front of you. Right. And I don't know if you experience this, but I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. Where's the salt and pepper? Look right in front of you. Right. Well, there it is. Right. And I think this has been sitting right in front of us. I really do. And your word obvious is so poignant that
it is.
It's right there. These students come to our building every day. How about we include them?
Right. And sometimes we just overcomplicate things when we really don't need to.
So true. So true.
And Myron, earlier you were talking about the pandemic and how it's just, been very interesting times. And over the past year, this moment that we're in has provided many of us in education an opportunity to reflect on our current practices. And I'm curious to know, what are some of your takeaways and reflections, about where you think we'll go from here in education, particularly at schools where, we're beginning to reopen and, we're discussing going back and return to normal. What does that mean to you?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've used this term now many times. Whatever the return, Catarina, is going to look like, um, it's going to be called the new normal, right? We I've been talking to schools that say we can't believe our parent teacher involvement at the number of parents that tuned in via Zoom or Teams or whatever to take part in parent teacher interviews. Okay, well, we're going to use that feedback as maybe a way to offer another service to our parent community on how we're going to communicate. I think there's some good feedback there. But in some ways, I think that our laptops have become more than a cutting board, right? For some people, they didn't know how to turn on a laptop computer or use a tablet, and we have reached out in ways that we haven't normally been able to. I think we're gonna take some of that forward, but I would say the first canary in the coal mine for me was, I think, last April. I was on a call with some teachers in the United States. And one of them said, I don't know what to do with my assessments. My kids are just Googling the answers at home. And clearly this teacher was used to having them in a room where the assessments were controlled and all that. And that's all fine. But then another teacher piped up saying, maybe that's a sign we need to change our assessments. And it's like, like if you look at contemporary standards around the world, and I would say some structures have been well ahead of the curve on this, such as IB and some countries and some schools. But if you just kind of look globally right now, you see that the verbiage is changing in learning outcomes to create, analyze, model, design. And I think what this pandemic year has given us a big shove, if you will, it's in the direction of, so what does that look like for students to do that? Because teachers who had tackled those types of learning outcomes prior to COVID, in my experience and my observations and chatting with hundreds of them, they managed much better than the teacher I cited earlier who didn't know what to do because their kids are going to Google the answers. Google was around before COVID. I think it's going to be around after. And I think the message for us was that we need to shift our instructional objectives and definitely our assessment objectives. That doesn't mean, and Catarina, I hope that any teacher listening to this would pretend I said this 1,000 times. It doesn't mean that our content isn't important. It's really important that students understand the major, the scaffolding involved in biology terms and chemistry and PE and math and social studies. That it matters, but it matters far more what you're going to do with it. And I think we saw that during COVID, that there's lots of different ways we can do. So, and if there's something from my consulting side, which is amazing right now, is that my email is lighting up from high schools. I'm surprised. Just they are far. I'm having people reach out from high schools more than ever, and I got to think that that's a result of what we've experienced during COVID. That not only our students can learn without us, although the research suggests that guidance is super important, we also are learning that our students can learn from someone else. And if we're going to marry content with skills, let's get on it. And I think that's something that we're learning. I mean, we did a event with your students at the end of the year. And when we asked the question, so what have you got up to during COVID how did you use your time? I mean, I was blown away by your students. I was learning to play the violin. Another person was producing songs and putting them out on YouTube. Another student said, I really got into this specialty cooking. And it's like, guess what? They're learning. And they will do that with or without us. So
absolutely.
Those are
absolutely. No, you just hit a home run with that. And speaking about Google, yeah, I mean, that's one of the tools that are just so easily accessible to our 21st century learners. But if we're asking students where they can derive the answers to the questions that we're asking through Google, then we're definitely asking the wrong questions. Yeah. But that's a great point. And you were talking about our school, And that was going to be one of my next and final questions for you is, so we're one of the schools that reached out to you, and I know that many other schools have as well. And so what do you see as trends and opportunities as a result of, interacting with so many different educators on a global scale?
Well, I think what's become really clear is that everything that we have discussed today and many, many other topics, these are a community conversation. I think that parents want to know. If I flip through the Rolodex of places where I have included a parent meeting around this or a session from Grand Rapids, Michigan to Macedonia, Bulgaria, Recife, Brazil, if we throw out the option for a meeting for parents, hey, we're going to be talking about this in our school. Do you want to come out for a session I entitled 5 Things Parents Should Know About Education in 2021? If it's like Recife, 300 parents show up and they want to know. It was like a mini UN, people with headsets, so it's translated into Portuguese. And yeah, let's talk about what universities are looking for. Let's talk about what modern learning outcomes look like. And guess what? They're different than what we experienced. If you ask the parents in the room, if you ask you and I, Catarina, what are some things you remember from needing to show or produce when you were in school? Well, I'd have to memorize the 50 states, or I would need to memorize this or recite that. Those things are important. But what my daughter's calling me. I'm hitting hold. The marriage of content and skills is super important, and parents want to know that. It's not 1978. It's not 1987. It is a time to shift this conversation. Look, this is one of the premier student events that we offered, and it was the year end for EABH. How long did students hang around asking questions and wanting to chat afterwards? Hour and a half, right? This is after a long year of nothing but Zoom. But this is what it was literally after that session, Catarina, that I thought, okay, so we've included teachers in what we do. We've included parents in what we do. I think our next big step is the students. And I think your school is, and the leadership in your school is making it obvious that people are figuring that out. I think what our next questions are is how are we going to do that? And how do we bring their voice in? And I think that's when we're going to really be helping prepare our next global citizens.
Absolutely. And I think this really rings true of your book, right? Your new book about giving students a say and going back to the obvious. It's so obvious. Why not involve students, when we're doing this for the students, of the students, by the students? We've got to give them a say in order to move forward with student agency. Myron, thank you so much for sharing a few minutes of your busy life. I know you're in between staff meetings at the moment, and thank you so much for connecting. It's always great speaking with you, and energizing and just really inspirational. And I'd like to also thank SchoolRubric for connecting us again. Thank you.
You are most welcome. For anybody who thinks, I can't believe that dad just put his daughter on hold. My daughter is building a food cart at the moment and starting her own business. So I know what she's calling me about. She's calling me about the paint choices. So one more example of COVID. My daughter she was sitting there. She had time on her hands and she's not alone. Kids are making things happen out there. This has been a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank SchoolRubric, and can't wait to see you again, either Zoom or in person.
Yay. Thanks, Myron. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for watching SchoolRubric on YouTube. Make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe in order to stay looped in on all of our diverse collection of shows, interviews, panels, tutorials, and more from educators around the globe. And visit us at SchoolRubric.com for even more great content, such as our online articles, Interact magazine, featured podcasts, and more. Thank you.